So in addition to the things that Lisa just mentioned, I'm also probably one of the only academics in the world who have actually had an interest in EP elections for now 25 years. And I will try and bring some of this into this training here. The training is really thought of as a bit of a sort of vantage point through which to look at the elections that are upcoming in May, and some of the things that we simply know from the past, both about EP elections from political science literature, but also what we know from some of the studies of journalistic differences in the EU. And then I will conclude with some points to consider as you prepare for the coverage of the EP elections. So the elections themselves, of course, they have a bit of a history, and that is an important history to sometimes keep in mind, because it also shows that from the point of view of, let's say, the parliament and the idea of why do we even have European elections, there have been some successes and less strong successes over the past elections. So originally they were introduced to make the European Economic Community back then in many ways more democratic, to increase both the legitimacy and the accountability of decisions that were taken at the EU level. And that's still important to keep in mind, that that is still one of the key goals for even having EP elections altogether. But there were some auxiliary or some secondary goals with actually having these elections back then, which was to increase public interest, increase involvement with, but also support for the European project. Now, these are not goals that we have invented. These were stated goals as to why was the parliament actually introduced and why were there elections introduced as part of the EU level polity in 1979. And we could do as a warm-up a little sort of review of how successful that has been since 1979 until today. And it is clear to say that these objectives have not all been sort of super successful in terms of what they have achieved, and that's important because it gives us the lens through which we're looking ahead to the 2024 elections. First of all, and Tommaso also ended on saying this, that for a long time, European elections were not really considered actual European level elections, but very much what in the literature and popular discourse by now also has been called second order national elections, so that the national political arena, the national political context, the national political discourse is very influential in the European election considerations, and that many voters, as we know from now a couple of decades of research, base their votes in the European elections very much on what is going on in national politics. And that means that for any kind of second order election, and that is not only second order elections when it comes to Europe, but you see patterns in the same direction when you look at, for example, vote for municipalities or regions or whatever you have in your national election context, that these kind of elections that are either for the supranational or the subnational elections are second order national elections, where the national political level is playing a big role, because these other elections, local or supranational, are really seen as a forum in which it is relatively easy to send a signal to the incumbent parties. So imagine you've just voted for a government and you're not kind of for a party, and there's a new government and you're really happy with what they're doing. You might send a support signal in a European election by sticking to your guns and also voting for that party in a European elections, and vice versa. If you're not really happy with what happened at the last national elections, second order elections, local or European, are really sort of a bit of a three-way of sending a signal to national representatives. Over the years, actually, the elections became less about only being a reflection of national political dynamics, but one of the things that happened over the years was that they evolved to be more about the European Union, but maybe less about political choices and political issues that played in Europe, but more also as a vote on the EU as a polity. So whether or not the Commission and the Parliament was seen to be doing the right things, or whether or not you would be favoring more or less degrees of European integration. So in a way, the elections have become unintendedly also a forum for contestation over the future of the EU, so a place in which votes were also cast as a result of whether or not you would be seeing this as something that was inherently a good thing or a bad thing. So if you draw the real sort of picture, big picture from 1979 until today, what you've seen over the course of time is that the salience of the elections has gone up, and we have done analysis of media coverage also across many of these years that also shows that also in the media and the press coverage of the elections, that there is more news devoted to the European elections, but that does not necessarily mean that the degree of Europeanization, and I'll get into what that means in a second, has increased. In fact, in some of the countries where you've seen that the salience goes up, there's also a bit more of the domestic focus in the coverage. One of the reasons being that in the countries where Europe starts to matter, that also means that national political leaders like to speak about European issues. And one thing we know about journalism and journalists is that if national leaders speak on European issues, there is a preference for putting them in with quotes and on the air rather than members or candidates for the European Parliament. So there's a bit of a paradox, a journalistic paradox here, that the more salience there is, that does not necessarily mean that the degree of Europeanizations and the reflection of this being European elections goes up, but it sometimes means that national politicians take over also the arena of European level elections. What we've also seen over the years is that the union or the collaboration and the integration itself has become an object of contestation, which was not really an intended idea for having the European elections, but has become an outcome of it. We do see in voting behavior research over the course of the years that EU issues have become more important in voting decisions. So it is no longer only dictated by national political considerations, but also European ones. But sometimes, again, these are more at the very macro and almost meta level. Am I in favor or against more or less European integration, rather than, for example, the stances on very specific European discussions around, for example, climate or development of certain industries and these kind of things in Europe. Over the years, and that's important, there were elections to increase engagement with and the legitimacy and the accountability, but there has actually not been a real sort of tremendous increase in public engagement over the years. In fact, if you look at some of the lines, and it's a bit of a muddy picture, obviously, with new member countries entering continuously since the first elections in 79 until now, but if you see anything, there's actually a bit of a decrease in the overall turnout, and then, you know, some occasional returns of that, but it is not you would say if these European elections had been hugely successful, you might have predicted that in 1979, when the parliament really had very few formal powers, very little formal decision-making, until today, when it is much more strong in terms of co-decision powers and in terms of actual political weight, you might put forward a working hypothesis that a big institutional change and a big increase in power and relevance of a political entity would automatically also lead to more turnout and to more engagement. But that is not what we can see over time. Same thing with citizen knowledge. If you look at it over time, it's very hard to measure across time. And obviously also some of the knowledge questions actually change in terms of what is the correct answer over time. For example, whether or not the parliament has any competences in area A, B, and C is a topic that has actually changed, or a question that where the correct answer would have changed over time. But also here, you do not see maybe one of the intended consequences of having elections, which would also be to simply make the European electorate more knowledgeable, that is also, you know, not one of the big outcomes that you see across time. We see something rather peculiar in a lot of public opinion data around elections, is that support for the EU tends to have a bit of a dent around EP elections. And that for a long time was something that really puzzled those that study public opinion and support for European integration. And one of the explanations that have been put forward, that this question of support for the EU overall, that it maybe get a bit of a dent and a bit of a downward turn around elections. One of the reasons is that elections are contestation, so you also sort of open up for some of the machinery of conflict and battle battles. You see what you could say politics in action, and that does not maybe represent a sort of unified type of European institution. And that is why you see a periodic and small dent in public support around EP elections. And one final, completely unintended outcome of just having elections for the European Parliament is that it has become a rather sort of attractive arena for launching new political movements and initiatives. So across the political spectrums, parties from the left or to the right, progressive and more conservative parties, many have actually used European elections as a bit of a sort of first time experience of getting a campaign going and getting introduced into the political arena. The Green parties in Europe, for example, in many cases launched around European elections and later became integrated in the national systems. And also you've seen similar things on what you would rather maybe classified on the right wing or the populist right wing. So this was, if you look really sort of big picture, what happened since 1979 until 2024, but just having these elections, some of these dynamics were very much outcomes of intended consequences of holding elections, but quite a few of these are also simply goals that did not materialize to the extent that they were maybe originally intended, and or simply dynamics that occurred in the political arena over the course of the years. Now, if we then turn to the question of, so have European elections, for example, contributed to a European public sphere, and also in terms of creating news and journalistic production across the different nation states around the elections? Well, first of all, there's a big discussion in the literature what the European public sphere is, and especially if there are Germans in the audience, they will know that there is a long and rich history of writing about the European public sphere across time. But the idea is that there are some interrelations between different public spheres, and that is something that you have seen in multiple arenas over time, whether it's the academy that has a very long tradition of working across borders, but also churches and courts actually have that. And one expectation that one might also have for EP elections is that these linkages become stronger over time as also the EU has more to say in more arenas. There's a big discussion as to whether or not a full-blown sort of one singular type of European public sphere is necessary for having successful European elections. You know, one public discussion, one type of European list, only one type of voting options presented to the electorate, or whether or not the more realistic notion is a Europeanization of the national public sphere, so that you still see it through the lens of the national political arenas, but that you do have these points in time where there's both a sort of a more vertical level of Europeanization, where, for example, you know, members of the European Commissions or candidates for the European Parliament would be visible in other countries. And of course, we by now have political parties such as Volt that very much tries to drive that element back, but also more horizontal Europeanization, where you, for example, in news coverage in France would see something of what is going on in the German run up to the European parliamentary elections. And then there's a sort of very minimalistic notion saying, well, neither a truly singular European public sphere is in existence, nor is there a very strong degree of Europeanization of national public spheres, but there are simply some examples, specifically whether or not it's a debt crisis or a euro crisis or an immigration crisis, but where topics emerge and create something that is more of a European public sphere, and then it kind of evaporates again afterwards. All three examples are present in work on this topic, and all three examples or strands here are also important to think through what the role of journalism is and of the coverage of the EP elections. But one thing that is extremely important that Thomas also just concluded on is that we cannot really speak about one coverage of the European parliamentary elections. And here I return to some work that actually started back in the 1999 election and has continued in 2019, and will also do some of the work again in 2024, but just a single slide to really highlight the case of the difference in terms of the coverage of European elections and how different it is in the different countries. So here's a graph that shows how much news was there simply about the EU in the run-up to the EP elections in 1999 and 2004, 2009 and 2014. And just for simplicity here, this only includes the 15 countries that were members in 1999. There is also data for the other ones, but just to show some of the differences. Of course, you can see within countries, let's take the example here of France, that that where the 2014 election was very visible compared to earlier elections in France. But you could also take the case of, let's say, the Netherlands, the country that I spent most of my time in, which was, if you look at the black bars in particular and take the Netherlands 1999 as an example, the Dutch were actually European champions. The Dutch press were European champions of neglecting the EP elections in 1999. And there you can really see the huge difference both across the countries, but also between the elections. The overall story is that there's somewhat of an increase in coverage across the line. Again, each of the national levels and development show a nuanced picture, but somewhat of an increase across the time. But very important, you are maybe very deprived if you are a news consumer and you lived in Belgium or in the Netherlands and wanted to learn about the EP elections in the first years of these graphs. And in other countries, there was more and a rather sizable degree of coverage of these elections. So that's a very important first conclusion. We should refrain from speaking about the journalistic coverage of the EP elections. There are really big differences between countries, but also across these elections. Now we might delve into a little bit of what might explain some of that difference in the coverage, and just again cutting to the chase and a very long and rich history of work in this area. So some things that we see, again, focusing just on simply the question of how much news is about the EU in the election campaign leading up to the elections. And we see, for example, the public service broadcasters tend to carry more news than the commercial counterparts, that by and large is less coverage of this in tabloid newspapers compared to more broadsheet or quality newspapers, quote unquote. We see an interesting finding that across the time, that rather than having more news about the EU in the run-up to the elections, the longer you've been a member, there's actually less news. So there's a bit maybe of a paradox here. One could say, well, it becomes ingrained in the sort of politics, so it maybe has little of the novelty than it has when you have your first EP elections, but just it is a pattern that the more EP elections that you've actually had, so the longer your country has been a member, the less news there is. Again, that's the general trend. There can definitely be cross-national differences in this. Then a very important one also from the journalistic point of view, the more elite dispersion there is, and by elite dispersion, we simply mean, how far are the political parties from each other in terms of their positions on various issues that have to do with Europe. If there is very little elite dispersions, that would mean that most political parties have more or less the same standpoint. And from a journalistic point of view, that is utterly not interesting, right? So if all parties think more or less the same, that actually leads to less coverage, and the more dispersion there is, so the more the political parties are in opposition to each other, have diverging viewpoints on this topic, the more coverage you also see of the EU in the run-up to the EP elections. It makes a lot of intuitive sense, but this is really now based on, numbers from multiple elections from multiple countries. And there you simply see, well, if all the parties are more or less in the same camp, that typically leads to less coverage. And then there's an interesting sort of a little abadabai or side story to that finding, that especially in the countries where the elites are by and large mostly on the positive side of supporting membership of the EU, but then there are some very vocal dissenting opinions in the elites. So that can be fringe parties of the left or on the right, for example, but that they operate in a situation where there's overall more positivity towards the EU. That also adds to the how much news you see about the EU in the run-up to the elections. So these are some of the sort of bigger explanations for this pattern that we see. Not one type of news coverage devoted to this topic, and real big differences across countries and across time. And if you then start to search for some of those patterns and want to identify them, well, what is it then that is driving, for example, the degree to which there simply is news about the EU? Well, these are some of the explanations to look for. And of course, from a journalistic point of view, the latter ones, if the parties are in disagreement with each other, that means there's also something to cover. May not be a big revelation to journalists in the room, but it is an observation that really matters also for going into campaign coverage. And now here are just the tables that show everything that I just said, which is way too small for the screens. So as we look ahead, what is then the situation? This was a bit of an introduction into some of the things that we know about what is driving the journalistic coverage of the EU in the run-up to the elections. And here I would say is the starting point for which we go into 2024. So first of all, if we look at where is the audience, where is the electorate on the EU, we see more of a polarization of this topic than we have done in the past. But in quite some countries, we actually see more support for European integration than we have seen, for example, 5 years ago. So there's definitely a story in trying to understand and depict the landscape with which we go into these EP elections. And some countries change and morph over time. Some countries, like, for example, the Netherlands, that has been traditionally a very pro-European country, but has moved a little bit downwards on sort of the degree to which there's support for European integration. And then other countries, like some of the Scandinavian countries that definitely came in at the more lukewarm end of things, are now way more pro-European in nature. So that's an important sort of backdrop against which we enter into the EP elections of 2024, that where the electorate is on this topic is rather nuanced and more polarized than it has been previously. But very important to, of course, note is that these EP elections are not, it is not the EU itself that is on the ballot, but are really some of the big political themes and choices that the parliament also has a say in over the next years, especially given the more elaborate powers of the parliament compared to the very early days, whether these are themes around geopolitics or climate or inequality discussions or the European autonomy in the world. But one of the things that from a journalistic point of view makes that interesting is to say that the conflict lines and the fault lines of political disagreements and interest from varying positions may not necessarily be the same on these topics, right? So this is also a point that really requires preparation ahead of covering the EP elections, because as we know from research, with these elections and European Union politics maybe not being super visible on the political agenda, to understand and to bring in these themes where the opposition lines and the conflict lines may not be the same across the themes is something that also requires a little bit of introduction to the audience and bringing in what are here the different positions and why is there political disagreement on these topics. But needless to say that there are some very big topics on the agenda for these elections that can be brought to fore in also the coverage of it. Another starting point for going into the 24 election is also a very big change in news consumption patterns over the past more or less decade. So when we started doing some of the research on this topic, as you will see back from 1999 to today, the world was a lot simpler to get a picture of what the national coverage of the EP elections would look like. You would basically get a fairly good grasp of that if you were analyzing, let's say, the two most widely watched main evening news shows and perhaps three papers with a bit of different circulation and political flavors in most countries. That would give you a fairly sort of varied picture of what the news coverage in country A, B, or C would then actually look like. This has changed a lot in recent years, and in terms of news consumption, we see not only a move for certain segments, and this is more pronounced in some countries than in others, but of avoiding news on some topics or news all in general, a rapid move towards news consumption online, and in particularly so in the sort of younger cohort, and also bringing in new groups that all of a sudden have quite some agency and visibility as providers of news and public information, including around the influencers. So these are big changes that set the scene also in part for the 2024 elections and the coverage of it. Then there are some topics that are on the agenda for 2024 that have typically not been on the agenda for EP elections. Questions around electoral integrity, the rules of the game, but also the trustworthiness of the process and of the results, and where we have seen or from elections in different countries around the world that the integrity of the electoral system and the process itself is being brought into question. And that also, of course, opens a whole, you can say it optimistically, a whole opportunity for journalists to also point towards what some of the hallmarks of that process is and how it is being safeguarded and guaranteed. But there's also a question of how successful some actors can be in maybe bringing attention to this topic. There's much attention to the role of platforms, bigger and smaller, but especially the bigger social media platforms, in providing an arena in which there's also information about these elections. And the 2024 elections happen at a somewhat interesting point in time because the platforms are very much central providers also of news still in also about the EP elections. And yet at the same time, some of the platforms have in more recent policy changes been quite explicit about the fact that they want to shy away from or down prioritize the amount of information they give to, or the amount of attention they give to news and to politics in general. So there's a very interesting story also to be told about what role the platforms actually will play in this election going forward. There's a big new and unknown topic on the agenda that has to do with the deployment of AI in political campaigns or as part of the campaign scenery more generally. I think this is one of the big unknowns for the 2024 elections, and maybe Thomas also touched on some of this, right? That we on the one hand have the availability of new technologies around generative AI and the ability to, at a very low cost, both financial and in terms of technical requirement, of producing content and producing campaign material, either about your own preference and preferred parties or about your opponents, and share that in ecosystems that are relatively good at targeting that information. And there are some suggesting that this might not be such a big problem as it is made out to be. And so far, most of the evidence has been anecdotal, and yet at the same time, we must also conclude that there's hardly been an election in the past 6 months where there's not been a campaign or an incident of an AI-generated message, whether or not these were in the Slovak, the Polish elections, or recently in India and Indonesia. And we're also seeing this play in, of course, in the US elections for this fall. So there's an open question as to whether or not this will be weaponized and be part of the EP election campaign. But of course, from a journalistic point of view, that is also one of these things to anticipate and be prepared in terms of doing reporting on this, when it might be deployed, and what kind of consequences that might have. And a final thought on this topic, all of these elections, including the EP elections 2024, happen in this, what you could almost say, the perfect vacuum or the perfect storm for election campaigns, where a lot of new guidelines and regulations and actual new requirements are in the make / have just been finalized, but not yet fully implemented. Rules and regulations about political micro-targeting, the EU Act itself, which is relatively what should you say, mild for journalistic organizations, but very strict when it comes to the deployment of AI that can heavily influence political outcomes and elections. But all of these things might have reached some level of political deal, but are not necessarily implemented yet in 2024 for the EP elections. So there's you can almost say, extra responsibility for covering and engaging with the EP elections. And one of those big challenges, and that will also be my final observation in this introduction, has to do with what some of this also means for the misinformation challenge, a discussion that has definitely been on the agenda for now quite a few years, but where there are good reasons to say that with the arrival of generative AI and other kind of campaign strategies, maybe there's a lot that needs to be said again about mis and disinformation challenges. And you've seen some of the examples that have been deployed in recent elections in other countries, also in the material covered by EDMO. And there's this journalistic challenge in how to deal with this topic, where on the one hand, attention is paid to the phenomenon and to the tactics and the playbook of deploying mis and disinformation, and at the same time also not to fall into the trap of devoting too much attention to the topic, which can cause almost alarmism and also cause some very impactful trickle-down effect, where questions can be placed then toward all kinds of information and not only mis and disinformation itself. So with this, I sort of come to an end of the introduction that was taking a little bit of a return to why do we have these European elections from the beginning, and what were some of the things that have really evolved over time in terms of them being successful in engaging the public, in providing more knowledge and excitement about having EU-level polity, to also looking at the differences in the coverage of the elections to really pinpoint the fact that there is no one size fits all. Journalistic coverage of EP elections really looks very different depending on where you are. And then maybe finishing here with a few points that are central to the 2024 coverage and the preparations in the lead of